Hello, awesome young writers. My name is Adam Byatt. I'm a novelist, a short story writer, and a high school English teacher. Last year, I had the privilege of winning the WestWords Living Stories competition, as well as the Blacktown Mayoral Creative Writing Prize. If you're wondering how on earth can you possibly fit a story into 500 words, then this video is going to help you with some skills and some tips and some strategies to shape your narrative and to help you make that work as awesome as you can possibly make it. Creating a story in 500 words is like looking at a photograph. It's this real snapshot of a single moment in time where you've got a person and an event. And from that particular moment, we want to draw out of that character their life, their experiences, their fears, their conflicts, all the things that has happened to them, and to see that moment as a piece of revelation, because I believe that great stories have people as their central focus. And then from that focus, we learn about ourselves, we learn about the world around us, we learn about each other. But still, how do you fit a story into 500 words? I like writing short fiction because it gives me a real boundary to work with. I'm very conscious that every word I use has to play a role in the story, that every word has to fulfill my character and my purpose, my setting, my theme of the story, and that all of these things build and build and build to create this remarkable picture of a character in their life. And it's about drilling down to the essence of that character and to be able to see that singular moment, that situation, to find out more about that character's humanity. And writing short fiction in like 500 words is a great way of teaching yourself structure, characterization, plot, motifs, allusions, using figurative language like similes and metaphors to be able to create a really engaging and at times a very complex piece of writing. And another reason that this is really great for short fiction is that it makes you really conscious of that singular moment, and to have that individual moment of a character's life really explored, and then you can explode that to look at a bit of their past and maybe even a bit of their future. So we're going to get started on this journey together, and we'll start with nothing more than a blank page, a desire to write, and maybe getting your brain into gear so that we can kick off. Now, a really important part of writing for a competition is being able to write to the prompt or the stimulus that you're given for that competition. In this case, your prompt is the other city. Now, it's your response to that prompt and that stimulus that's the very foundation of your narrative for this purpose. You don't want your story to be ignored or your poem to be ignored because you haven't referenced that prompt or that stimulus and you haven't built your story out of that stimulus. And you might be wondering, well, where do you go for your ideas? You can pay your mate in chocolate or donuts or hot chips, maybe ride on your bike to get ideas. But there are always stories and ideas everywhere you look. They're around every corner. They're in every book on your shelf and in your library. They're under the lounge cushions. They're even in your parents' photograph albums. You know, there's old book things where you got pictures that you have to look at, and they're under cellophane, all that kind of stuff. There are so many things that can inspire you. What's happening in the news? What's going on around you? Is there a story that maybe takes your interest in that particular way? Or are you keeping aware of what's happening in the news around you, either in your community or the bigger picture of the world? Is there a friend at school that's had something happen to them that you think might be a great story? For me, I love how the really mundane and perhaps even boring parts of a person's life are actually really great sources for stories. That a lot of my students say, "Oh, I've had a really boring life." It's like, no, 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 you haven't. There are so many things that you can explore that actually become a fantastic resource for telling a story. And so, what I want you to do is get yourself a pen and paper, or maybe a blank document in front of you, and you're going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And you are going to get your pen, and you're just going to write whatever comes to mind based upon the prompt, the other city. Okay? The idea being that your pen just keeps writing, or your fingers keep typing, whatever you're working from. But have a think about what this prompt inspires you to consider. Let everything that's in your brain just come out onto the page. Let everything just flow. If you don't know what to write, just simply write, I don't know what to write. Or you can type that and you keep writing that or typing that until your brain actually unclogs itself and you find an idea that you can run with. So get the pen and paper, get yourself ready, hit the pause button, give yourself 5 minutes, and we'll come back here shortly. Welcome back. Hopefully that has loosened up your brain. You've got a bit of inspiration happening. You've got a few ideas on the page, and we can return to those as inspiration for what's going to come next. Now, sorting out this really messy jumble that's all on your page and it's just looks atrocious is quite okay. Some ideas you'll look at and you just go, no, that's rubbish, and you chuck it out. Others you'll think about and then you'll go, nah, it's not really for me. And then there might be one or two that just sit there and you go, maybe that's something I can work on. And so maybe grab yourself a highlighter, have a look at your page and highlight what sticks out for you. What idea is going to actually perhaps resonate in your heart and your mind as a possible story idea? And so keep those to one side and we'll come back to those a little bit later. Now, it helps to have a framework to arrange your ideas. And I'm going to take you through what I take my students through. And you might have your own method for crafting a story and go ahead, use it. It's awesome. But if you're not sure what your creative writing process is, let me give you a good place to start to help you get your story idea together. With my students, I use a really simple alliterative list to help cover what are the essential elements of a narrative. And they are 5 Ps. And these 5 Ps are here to help you plan and develop your initial idea into a clearer narrative concept before we get to structure, before we do some writing. And so even I do this. I have to look at my 5 Ps and go whether it's a 500-word story, a 5,000-word story, or even a 50,000-word story. Same principles still apply. So those 5 Ps. Number 1, person, place, plot, problem, and purpose. Okay, those are the 5 Ps. We'll kick off one by one and we'll get into a little bit of detail. So first of all is your person or your persons. These are your characters. It's getting to know who's who in the zoo of your story. Secondly, place. Where's the setting of your story? When and where in time will your story actually happen? Number 3, your plot. This is the events of your story. Basically, what happens. Now, in a 500-word story, you're not going to have a lot of time to write a 1,000-year epic. It's not going to happen. So you might have 1, maybe 2 key events in your story. Number 4 is the problem. And so what is the problem that your character is going to experience in your story? In other words, what's the complication? What is their conflict they are facing in this story? Because without a complication, without a problem to solve or to address or to overcome, you don't really have a story that goes anywhere. That problem could be an internal one of how they feel. It could be an external one of something that happens to them or because of them. But without that complication, you're not going to have a great story. And the last P is purpose. And to put it as a question, what are you saying to your readers through this story? What's the overall concept you want to tackle with your narrative? The purpose is really tricky because at the beginning of your writing process, you probably haven't got a really clear idea of what your purpose is going to be just yet. You might have a sketch, you might have a couple of lines that give you a bit of an outline perhaps, but there's going to be things that you add to that as time goes on. It's hard to nail first up, but the more that you write and you work through the process, you're going to become clearer and clearer to work out your narrative's purpose and what you want to say to your audience. Now, those 5 Ps can be done in any order. It's not you have to do one after the other, but they're all interconnected. So your initial inspiration might be a place. It might be a building that you've seen or a location that you've been to or someone that you know. It might be a character, someone that you've seen walking along the street, or it might be a character you've had in your imagination for quite some time. You could have seen someone in the food court that looks interesting, and that might be someone for a story. Or you might have had this idea in your head for a while now that you want to explore a social issue, something that concerns you, something that you're worried about perhaps, and you've been trying to find a way to tell that story in writing. And so all of those things are going to make up what your narrative actually is. And so I'm going to apply this to one of my stories from last year. I'm going to start with my story that won the Blacktown Mayoral Creative Writing Prize. The story is called Cutting Through. So the person in my story is a middle-aged divorced man and his son. There are two characters, middle-aged father and his son. The place, I set my story at a local barber shop in West Point, a place that I walk past occasionally. The plot, well, basically, my dad goes to the barbershop because he needs a haircut, and his son recommended this barbershop as a place to go and get his haircut. While he's there, he thinks about his son who wants to move back in with him. And so which leads me to my problem. The main thing of my story is that I want to explore how the character's father, the father in the story, has to deal with his son who wants to move back home. He's about to go to university next year, and dad's home is closer than mum's home for university. And it's going to change their entire dynamic and their entire relationship. And so that's the problem that my character has to deal with. And so my purpose in telling that story then was I wanted to explore how masculine relationships, particularly those of a father and son, how they're shaped and how they're developed, and how those relationships might even be developed differently, perhaps in a richer way for the two of them. If I do the same thing to my other story from the Living Stories competition, We Three Kings, it looks a bit like this. So my persons, are three best friends. Okay, the place they meet up is the local kebab shop that I visit quite frequently if I possibly can. The plot of my story, single event. They meet together to have a meal, and they're going to catch up after being away from each other for far too long. My problem for my story is that these three men are unable to have a really deep conversation. All of their conversation exists on the surface, that they can talk about what's happening at work, they can talk about their kids, but they can't talk about things that are really hurting them inside and the struggles that each of them are facing. They all know what's going on, but they're not prepared to talk about it. So therefore, my purpose in my story was to actually explore how men's relationships are often just at the surface. They don't go deeper, and they don't allow men to actually talk it out and actually solve each other's problems for them. So you've got maybe an idea or two that you highlighted. So what if you take a few minutes now to see what could be my 5 Ps? Have I got a person? Have I got a place? Have I got a possible plot? Do I have a purpose? Do I have a problem in my story? Take you a few minutes, 5 minutes, and see if you can develop one of those initial ideas further. So hit the pause button and take 5 minutes. Okay, how'd you go? Do you still have some gaps there? If you do, that's not a problem. Sometimes it takes a while for a story to reveal itself when you've started from with a single idea and trying to work out how that's going to map out with the different pieces that you've got with your story. So for me, when I know what my 5 Ps are, I've got a really clear picture of what I want to write about. I might have written a couple of paragraphs or a few lines in my notebook about a character or a place or even a particular problem, or maybe even a purpose. But once I've run out of that initial creative spark, that creative energy that I've got for a story, I have to go back and work out, okay, what are my 5 Ps? And I lay it all out. Who are my characters, my persons, my people? What's the problem for my story? Where am I setting my story? What's going to be the problem? And therefore, what's the purpose to my particular story? So if you think of those 5 Ps as like the skeleton of your narrative, when you've got that in place, you have a framework. And then writing the story is simply putting on the flesh and the bones and putting in the organs and the heart and the head, the brain, the hair, all that kind of stuff to make that story a real living thing. And so to develop that idea into a story is perhaps the tricky part. And there's an old writer saying that says, write what you know. And that is useful to a point. What it implies is that when you know something really, really well, you can write about that idea or that topic authentically, that it feels real, okay, because you care about it. But to change that wording slightly, what if we said, write what you feel strongly about? Because for me, in my other 2 stories I just mentioned, that I feel strongly about how men relate to one another. And so I found characters and places and problems that my characters have to overcome to sort out. And that makes the story. And so then once I had my framework, I can then go back and fill in that story over my skeleton and give it the flesh and the bones, all the different bits and pieces. And so to make that story real, you take those 5 Ps to actually give it a platform, a foundation to work from. And I'm going to tackle each P one at a time and go a little further with it so you've got some more detail, some more information to play with. And how that applies to writing a 500-word story. So the first P is person. Come back to that, our first P. Now, within 500 words, a good parameter for that is going to be 1 up to 3 characters. If you've got too many characters, there's not going to be enough time to write about them all. It's not like you can fill an elevator full of people and write about them all because they're going to get squashed and smashed and ignored. So 1 to 3 people is perhaps the best starting point for a story of this length. If you're not sure who your story might be about, have a look around your classroom. Have a look at your friends. What about the people that you see on the bus or the train going to or from school? What if you're sitting in the food court of your local shopping centre? Have a look around and see the people that might be there. Do you see someone on a regular basis that interests you? What do they look like? All these things are going to help give you an insight into how people think and feel and act. Because people, they're fascinating. Not just what they wear, but how they think. It's who they are on the inside, in their hearts, in their minds. I've got that around the wrong way. Their hearts and minds, that we find out what people are truly like. So for your story, in 500 words, you're going to have 1 to 3 characters. That's about the maximum you're going to look at. And sometimes you want to maybe perhaps base a character on you, because I tend to use people that I know, or even myself, as the basis for something in a character. I just make up the rest of it. So if I think about the 3 men having kebabs at the local kebab shop, I base that really loosely on myself and a couple of good mates where we meet up and we just sit and chat. And the idea for the guy at the barber shop was simply built around the idea where you're going to get a haircut and you're chatting to the barber, you're talking about life. So that little moment that you find the character that's going to help you tell the story is awesome. So a couple of questions to consider. Here's something you can come back to later on. But how does your character feel about perhaps the city that they live in? That could be a suburb, the bigger city of Sydney or Western Sydney. What does that character want changed in their city or even in their life? How do they feel about what's going on? Are they in good health? Are they in bad health? What habits do they have? What do they do for fun? This is thinking through about how your character drives the narrative of your story. So you may want to pause here and make a few notes. Right, our second P is place. So think about where you live. What are some of those distinguishing buildings or places or shops near where you live or around where you live or even around your school? What catches your eye? as you're going to and from school, driving somewhere. Have a look around. Be an observer of the world to see how places look and what they could possibly reveal to you. Um, so for my story, cutting through, I use the barber shop because I walk past the barber shop if I'm going through the shops all the time. And this place fascinated me. It looks really flash. It's got beautiful black walls and gold trims. The lighting's lovely. Not that I've ever walked into the barber shop because I mean, look, hey, look at this hair. Um, but it was so different to what I'm used to seeing from the barbershops of my youth. These shops now where men go and get all their beards trimmed and their haircuts, all that kind of stuff. And then the kebab shop is simply a place that I visit as often as I possibly can. And those locations, I know the sounds and the smells and the sights and all those things that you go into a piece of art to make it real for the reader are so important. And if I'm thinking about this prompt, the other city, I look around Blacktown and there's so many different little shops that I spot that are really fascinating to me. There's a place along the main road out of Blacktown where there's a tattoo parlor and there's a whole bunch of just fast food shops that, during a roaring trade come nighttime. And then, but above the shops is this really old sign when perhaps the shopping center was a very different place, maybe decades ago. Or there's a next to the office works in Blacktown, there's a laundromat, or there's a blank vacant block of land next to office works, which used to have a drive-through COVID testing place, but now it's got food trucks of a weekend. So all these kind of places are potential opportunities for a story to use as a setting. And so in a story that is this long, one setting is probably the best place to have. Maybe two if you want to vary it as a way of contrast. But that single setting allows you to have everything contained in that moment. For me, having that single place of the barber shop or the kebab shop actually gave me a very precise place for my stories. And it gave me this stage, like a platform for my characters to perform on. That it gave me this place where I could have them interact and think and talk and explore themselves and perhaps even come to maybe no conclusion. But it's always this little platform that I want my characters to be on, that I can see them acting out the story that is happening. And so think about for your story. Here's a couple of things to consider. Where will you set your story? Okay, it's a really important thing to describe. Where is it going to be set? How will that particular place affect your character? For example, the kebab shop allows my characters to talk. They have food together and they chat. The barber shop allows a person to sit down while someone cuts their hair and have a bit of a conversation. It's always a way of trying to reveal that character and reveal the story that they're trying to tell and the examine the problems and the purposes of your story. So if you want to pause there for a moment, go make some notes and come back. Okay. I'm going to skip over plot for a moment because I want to address the problem of a story. Okay. So you perhaps remember from primary school, even high school, that the complication of a story is really important because it's the driving element of your story, of what happens in that plot and what happens in your story. Because without a complication, you've got a nice piece of writing, it's a nice vignette perhaps, it's about a character maybe, but we need to know what they're like as a person. How do they react and respond when things are not going their way? And a story is really about exploring how your main character deals with something in their life, some situation where their life goes absolutely pear-shaped in a little way or a huge way. And so I mentioned earlier that in my stories, the problems with this, it's a father who has to decide what to do about his son who wants to move back home. Or the problem is a group of friends who just can't open up to one another. Now, when I had those problems sorted in my planning, it meant that I could keep myself focused on the narrative and kept me connected to the heart of the story when I was rewriting and fixing stuff up. That particular problem kept me focused and kept me at the heart of what I'm talking about. And so when you know the problem of your character, it helps you keep that particular focus. And there are two ways that your conflict can be developed. Your problem could be internal, like my characters who can't speak to one another, or it could be an external thing where the son says, Dad, can I move back home? So both internal and external are essential for your storytelling, that you want to have those elements at the heart of your character, because then you've got a better story. And so to put a few more questions for you to consider in your planning and your prepping, that how does the problem affect your character's interaction with themselves? And how does that problem affect them interacting with other people or with, like their son, their spouse, their best friend, their mum, their dad, or even with the city? How is your character able to solve that problem by themselves? Or can't they solve it by themselves? What if they just can't overcome that particular problem? So if you want, hit the pause button again, then take a few minutes to go and make some notes about how might your problem impact your character. In dealing with purpose, we're probably dealing with the hardest part of the story to really nail down. But I think it's essential to get your purpose right, because then you write authentically and you write with clarity. If I don't know why I'm writing a story, then I don't know what I want to say. And then I can't make a good decision about my character choices, about my setting, about my plot, about my problem. It becomes a bit of a mess. And I think this is an area with students we really need to look at and say, well, why am I telling the story? What's it all about? And purpose comes through a heap of thinking and reflecting and then writing, making notes, rereading your notes, going over your story again and again, going through multiple drafts. That purpose may not happen in the first draft. It might be 3 or 4 drafts later when you finally work out the very specific thing you want to say to your reader. And there's nothing wrong with having that process working itself out, because when you have that purpose really firmly set, I think it makes your story so much richer, because you know where you're going to go and you know what you want your reader to feel with your story. And so don't overlook it. Don't ignore that part of your planning. When I say to my students when they're writing, I say there's 2 things I ask them to consider, and I want you to consider them as well. First of all, what am I trying to say in my story? So what am I trying to say? And secondly, why am I saying it? Have you really thought about the issue that you're talking about in your story, or has it just been left to one side for a moment? So, hit again that pause button. Have a think. What am I trying to say in my story? Why am I saying it? And you might have a couple of just quick notes to write down, and you'll come back to those. And that's fine. It will take time to work out, but that's also part of the writing process. So if you need to, hit the pause button again, and we'll come back in a moment. Lastly, plot. I left this to the end because once you've got your person, your place, your problem, and possibly your purpose, then you can begin to give your story a bit of a structure. And we structure that through our plot. Now, in 500 words, in something this short, you're not going to cover a huge length of time. You're not going to be covering weeks, months, years, forget centuries. You've probably got maybe a few hours of story time to tell. Perhaps it's even as long as a few minutes. You might be able to get it to a couple of days. But knowing that singular plot and the event that you're going to look at is essential for that storytelling. So in both of my stories, the event was really simple. One was getting a haircut. Secondly, having a kebab together. That's it. That was my event of my story. That's the singular plot moment that I had. And your story might have 1 or 2 moments that happen. It doesn't have to be too many, because plot leads into knowing the structure of your narrative. You probably learned in primary school that a story has an orientation, a complication, events, and a resolution. And that structure applies here. So when I am writing stories, I'm very conscious of the shape of my story. I'm very aware of my orientation. my complication, my events, and finally my resolution. That happens in everything that I write. And you look at television shows and movies, you'll see the same pattern happening over and over and over again. And when I have that structure set in place, that plot works effectively to tell my story, to highlight my purpose. And so if you've forgotten what that was in primary school, then your orientation sets the setting and the character of your story. It's not some vague description, it's not some long, waffly character description. It's really to the point. You hook your reader in the first few lines of your story to say, here's my character, here's my setting, here's what's going on. So once you've got that orientation set up, you bring in your complication, or in our case, the problem. So for a 500-word story, a good rule to use is that within the first 10% of your word counts, in this case about 50 words, you should have introduced your complication. That might be in your first sentence, but definitely within your first paragraph. So you've kicked off with an orientation, you've brought in your complication, and from that point, you're going to be exploring the events of your narrative and how they affect and impact upon your character. Okay? And so when you have that event introduced, you're going to ramp that up towards the conclusion of the climax of your story. And for me, I need to know what the end of my story is before I kind of write the whole thing. I might have an idea, but unless I know what the end of my story is, perhaps even the last line of the story, I feel a little bit out of order. I know some writers will simply sit down and go, okay, cool, story time, here's an idea, go. They write start to finish and then work out at the end what they're talking about. They don't even know what the ending is going to be in their story. I'm not that kind of person. I need to know what my end is. Once I've nailed my ending, once I know what I'm aiming for, then I can build the events and the complication and orientation really firmly as part of my storytelling. So you got to think about what works for you. Do you like to know what the end is, or do you want to write towards the end? Or it's up to you. So now you've got yourself your 5 Ps. You've worked out your person, your place, your problem, your plot, and your purpose, I think, if I get those right. You've got this framework now, but then how do you write your story? How do you actually go about doing it? There's an old writer from the 60s called Betty Flowers. She put forward this idea that there are 4 roles that a writer has in the process of crafting and writing a story. And if you approach them in the right way, it can make your task more efficient. So the very first type of role that a writer has is that of the drafter. You take all that enthusiastic creative energy that you've got, the bright idea that you've had, the character or the plot or the setting, and you throw it all on the page. You make a great big wonderful spaghetti mess of ideas and you write them all down. You don't let your brain get in the way. You just simply write. It could be characters and setting, description, or dialogue. You just get it out there. And when you're finished, you put your pen down, you'll walk away for a little while. And you might write a complete first draft of the story. You might have written 500 words. And that's awesome. But it's going to be rubbish. First drafts are always going to be rubbish. I tell this to my students. I tell them that my first drafts are always rubbish. And they kind of look at me and go, you're strange, sir. But no, that's the thing. You have to accept that the first draft is going to be far from perfect. But you just have to get it done. And it's really comforting to know that there are professional authors who sit down and go, yeah, my first drafts absolutely suck. And every writer goes, oh, thank you for telling us the truth. So first draft could be rubbish, but who cares? You've got it down on the page. The second role, give your story some time to breathe and maybe give it overnight. The second role is that of your architect. Now, your architect is the person who comes in and begins to organize your story. It's a bit like you're building a house. You've got the 5 Ps and your person, place, problem, plot, and purpose. And the architect begins to arrange those and sort of build things in a way that's logical and makes sense. And you start to see, oh, that paragraph's in the wrong spot. Or this line I can cut out of my story. This character's wrong for my story. I've got a better idea for how my story might end. And so you spend some time rearranging your draft or adding to your draft with the architect frame of mind that you kind of build that bigger picture of start to finish. And for me, that's meaning that I know my start, my orientation, my complication, my events, and my resolution. 500 words, not a lot, still need lots of planning though. Once I've given that a run through, we bring in our third role, that of the carpenter. This is where you do all the heavy lifting. This is where you do all the creative work of storytelling, where you put in the roof and the walls and the floor, you put in the kitchen and the toilet, and you put down the carpet and put pictures on the walls. All of these things go into making your story the best that it can be. So the carpenter's role is to use all your knowledge of sentence structure, figurative language like similes and metaphors. You might use allusions, motifs, dialogue, all of those things that go into writing a creative piece. This is what the carpenter does. And the carpenter will go backwards and forwards through the story to fix up stuff until it looks pretty much perfect. Then finally, the last role is that of your judge. The judge comes in and has a look at everything from front to back, top to bottom, and looks for spelling errors, use of incorrect words, like if you use the wrong there or there. You might have punctuation errors missing, your dialogue's not quite correct. They will go through and make sure that it looks as perfect as it can possibly be. And once you've done that, then your story is complete. So knowing that there are different roles in the writing process, that of the drafter, the architect, the carpenter, and the judge, can help you know where you are in the process. Because sometimes you might write something and go, oh, that's rubbish. That's probably your judge looking over your shoulder and going, oh, yeah, that's awful. But you've got to let your drafter have all that fun first, then the architect, then the carpenter, to make sure that story really works. And so this is what I do. I write out of order. When my carpenter comes in, I'm putting in the walls and the floors, and it's all out of shape sometimes. But I need to have that process. I might write my events, the main parts of my story, and go and fill in the gaps until I've got a complete first draft. And then I'll go back front to back over and over again until that story is as close to perfect as I can make it. And so one thing to think about now is then, how do you use your language to tell a story? Each writer has their own voice, their own style, and each story will have its own voice and its own style. And whether you like to have very elaborate sentences full of description and imagery or simile or metaphor, or if you prefer really simple, straightforward, simple sentences, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it is about what is going to fulfill the purpose of your story. Everything has to keep that focus on the story that you are telling. There's no point in having lots of remarkable description if it doesn't add to what you're doing in that narrative. So description, dialogue, similes, metaphors, allusions, etc., they all have to be specific to the needs of your story. Do you need to describe the character's physical appearance? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I find that in my storytelling, I very rarely actually include a character description that's physical, especially if it's in a very short piece of writing. And for a longer piece, maybe, but often I find that I let the character, the internal world of the character, carry the weight of the story. Whether my character has long hair or short hair or wears Converse or Vans is perhaps unimportant. It might be in the story, but if it's not important, I tend to leave it out. And so when you're going through that carpenter phase of your writing, you are looking for what is actually going to fulfill the purpose of my story. Am I getting there through my language? And added to that is the old phrase of show, don't tell. And I've seen in my students' work where they try to give me this lovely description of a place or of a person, but I don't understand, or I don't see, I suppose, how that place or that character interact or intersect. I want to see my character responding to their environment. I want to know how they feel when they walk into a particular place, whether it's a house, a lounge room, a shop, a Macca's, whatever. And so you want to have that showing of your character doing something, having that showing where the character feels and responds to their environment and responds to what they're feeling and thinking throughout the duration of that story. So you've done your 5 Ps. You've gone through your drafting phase, then followed by the architect, and then the carpenter, and finally the judge. And you got to the end and you go, well, do I give my story a title? And I think you should. I think a good title is at the heart of what the story is all about, so that the title gives the reader a bit of a clue to the heart of the story, its theme or its purpose or its idea. So when I told the title for my story, We Three Kings, this is the one set in the kebab shop, I used that line from an old Christmas carol. So I wanted to reflect this idea of how men see themselves and how that role could be, or perhaps even should be. And then I subverted that with the title of the story. And in the same way, I used a bit of a play on words for my story, Cutting Through, where having it set in a barbershop, where you're literally cutting hair, is a pun in cutting through. But also the internal level of that for the character, where his son's question, can I move home with you, begins to cut through his sense of self and cut through his thinking and how he feels. So the title was that focal point for the story. Sometimes I have a title first up and I know what my title will be, and that's going to help frame my story. Other times I've written a story with a rough idea of what a title might be, and I change it at the very end. Or I've sat down to write lists of titles and worked out what will my story be called. Spend some time thinking about a title, because it's important to help guide and shape your readers' direction with the story. It's the first thing they're going to read, and then they're going to follow that through the story. So by the time they get to the end of it, they go, I understand why you call the story this particular title. So there's lots to try and cover and that we've covered today, and you can welcome to go back and rewind and revisit this all the time. And I really wish you all the very best for your writing, both now for the competition at school and in the future. And maybe I'll see your story in a WestWords publication someday, or I'll see your book on a shelf. And I really hope that happens. So best of luck with your writing, and all the best.